Okay. Oh, need microphones. Oh my goodness gracious. Having a moment. Always something. Okay, there we go. Perfect. Okay. It's too loud, as always. So today we're going to keep talking about work. Obviously, for those wondering, I have now marked approximately 12% of the exams. And Jessica has yet to jump into it because that's the TA for the course. She's been busy, but she's assured me she's going to get working on that this weekend. So hopefully we can punch that along quickly. Again, I'm hoping to have it done by next Wednesday. We'll see how that actually works out. And usually, if I sit down and do it, I can knock out 10% in about an hour. So with some help from the TA, I should be able to get there. But I will keep you updated as we go. Okay. So other thing, I deleted both of the sets of slides for work that were there last time, and I updated it, and now it says like work 2026. So those are the official slides. So anything that's not in there, but yeah, it's basically the same, just with those. You could have just asked without the "please for the love of all that is good." Okay. So my hand, but you're talking. I'm sorry. Yeah, happy to. I can make it completely dark in here if you want. Now you can't even see your keyboard. No, I'm kidding. Yes, okay. Lights slightly darker. I don't know how people teach with the lights all the way up. Yeah, so I replaced the slides, but honestly, with the exception of the slides that I didn't talk about last time, I think everything's basically the same. So, I didn't change anything else, and I looked through it, and I think everything's the same. So, it's just those slides with the bar graphs at the beginning that I was like, I don't really love these anymore. I fell out of love with those slides, and what happens when you fall out of love. Okay, so yes, you don't have to worry about those. They won't be tested or anything like that. Okay, now this slide. Okay, I'm trying to remember where I was last time, and I'm a little bit mixed up. I meant to go back and watch the video, but I got busy with other things. Okay, I think we're kind of at around 1973. It was 1973, right? And I did check. We have our Yom Kippur War, sometimes called the Arab-Israeli War of 1973. The U.S. sides with Israel over the Palestinians and other Arab groups. And for this, you get an Arab oil embargo that starts in 1973, driving up the price of energy all across the West, but especially in the United States. And this, along with the increased competition from foreign manufacturing, really brings the economy to a halt. Okay, now I remember what I need to say last time. Did that earlier today, and I threw the thing halfway across the room. It's like this very smooth metal. I feel like it should have a grippier surface, but there you go. I almost killed a student with the very pencil I hold in my hand. No, I'm kidding. Just flung at great velocity because a hand talker. Okay, so what else is going on? So along with all of this, by the 1970s, right, and certainly through the 1970s, we're facing a parallel crisis to the strictly economic one. And that is a crisis of the welfare state, right? And specifically, a crisis in government debt. Paying for all of these welfare state services for a lot of Western governments had become increasingly expensive. They had these increasingly large and bloated bureaucracies that were sucking up a lot of resources, creating a lot of long-term liabilities in the forms of pensions and extended benefits for employees, and really just creating a lot of problems, right? It was becoming increasingly apparent that Western governments were going to struggle to continue offering services at the level they were. And so what happens, right, is we ultimately get to the era of what will come to be called neoliberalism. And there are kind of three neoliberalism, right, or the neoliberal moment. And there's kind of three figures that become particularly paramount in this kind of economic moment and the restructuring of Western kind of welfare states. So the first two you've probably heard of before, because I'm writing on orange, I'm going to switch to a green pen. So in the UK, right, we've got Margaret Thatcher. In the US, we got Ronald Reagan. And then in Canada, right, we've got sort of a few figures that sort of all go along with this. The first being Brian Mulroney, the conservative or progressive conservative prime minister. But then, Jean Chrétien, I think there's an A in there. I can't remember how to spell his name. Jean Chrétien, and then his sort of acolyte or successor, Paul Martin, and all of these figures basically, one of the big things they're notable for is restructuring or largely cutting back the welfare state. And, the public sector in general. Okay, so this affects kind of young workers in all sorts of ways, right? So we take these two kind of, these two trends, right? So, kind of a slowing of the economy from on the manufacturing side, right? So a lot of those blue collar jobs are put under pressure. By the time we get into the 90s, we're starting to see way more globalization as well, which is doing more of that. And again, into China in the 2000s and the 2010s, right? Blue collar workers are put under more and more pressure. And in the public sector, right, we see, cutbacks to the public sector. So there's fewer jobs available, right? Keeping older workers, but hiring fewer younger workers. And so a lot of the good jobs that were available in the past for young workers coming into the economy are being sort of held by silents and baby boomers who are just going to hold on to those jobs basically until retirement, and new hiring in those sectors really slows down. I don't know if I mentioned this last time. I will mention it here really quickly. The other thing that's happening in manufacturing is, and this is continues from really the 1970s till today, is companies start investing more in automation, right? It raises productivity, but it also cuts back a lot of jobs that used to exist, right? So automation is going to be something that continues to put pressure, until recently, I think, mostly on blue-collar workers, and that's been pretty consistent, right? And whenever there are moments of economic downturn, companies often invest in greater automation, essentially to cut costs, right? I'll give you one very quick example of this, which I always found really interesting, because I have lots of friends who work kind of in oil and gas. And if we go back to 2014, so this is, one of these moments, the average number of workers on an Alberta that it took to run a rig in Alberta, right, an oil rig, was about 30. By 2021, right, so right in here, there's a big, between 2014 and 2021, there's a big bust in oil prices. By 2021, the average number of workers required to work a rig is 3, right? They've automated so many of the processes on oil rigs that ultimately it takes way fewer workers to operate an oil rig than it used to, right? And those are a lot of blue-collar jobs that were fairly unskilled, that are now just gone, right? There's 27 jobs gone per rig. And I remember at one point during the North Dakota oil boom, some of the Canadian rigs were being brought down to North Dakota to do drilling, and the North Dakotans referred to them as transformers because they were so technologically advanced compared to the stuff that was being used in North Dakota because of all the automation tech that was being used on Canadian rigs. Okay. So what's the effect of all of this? All right, we'll clear all that off. So the effect, right? So we see this largely starting with Gen X, right? So Gen X are the first recipients of these sort of problems, but certainly not the last. Increasingly what happens from Gen X forward is that young people, rather than having these kind of two paths, right, either into well-paid blue-collar work or into well-paid public sector work, depending on kind of what sector, what kind of social class you come out of, they're increasingly all sort of put into the service sector, right? In different ways. So the service sector, right, is very broad. And there's sort of upper and lower tiers to the service sector, right? Upper tier, you're thinking things like teachers, nurses, doctors, computer programmers, engineers. But mostly where we see our young people coming into the market is that lower tier, which is things like retail, sales, like some low down forms of administration, a lot of customer service jobs, clerical, especially for women, childcare, but you're not teaching, but just childcare, which is relatively poorly paid, are all places that people sort of end up to start their working lives, right? Now, as compared to those older jobs, right, which tended to have, decent wages, benefits, and were good ways to start out a career and build your sort of resume, jobs in the service sector, right, tend to offer poor wages, poor benefits, if there are benefits at all, which there generally aren't. Transient workforces, right, because people kind of shift through these places. There's a business concept called churn, right, where employees are just churning through these places. So you're kind of constantly doing workplace training. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And yeah, typically little room for advancement. Though honestly, a lot of companies, from McDonald's to Enterprise Rent-A-Car, will pitch it to you that, you could make a career here at Enterprise Rent-A-Car. Like you might be working here for the rest of your life. And if you believe that, I have a bridge in Brooklyn I'm willing to sell at a reasonable price, because most of these places don't have much in terms of upward mobility, but they'll present themselves as having that. Okay. So the Gen X, we see more of them funneling into the service sector, and they come up with a nickname for this, for the jobs that are available to Gen X, and this is what they call McJobs, right? And obviously, like McDonald's, right, this denotes pretty low quality. You're a cog in a machine, and you're generally put through a whole bunch of pretty standardized processes. So you are just the latest thing. And I always think of the call center. I had a few friends who, as they were going through university or kind of taking a year or two off after high school, ended up working in call centers. And, the level of standardization in those jobs, and it's like you quitting doesn't matter because they're just going to throw in any other body into that call center to do the exact same job you're doing, right? And from, Gen X all the way to Gen Z, increasingly what we've seen is that the jobs that are available to a lot of young people, especially those with less education, are just those McJobs, right? Are just those jobs in that lower tier of the service industry. And it's a real challenge to go from that tier into kind of career path work, right? Most will eventually manage it, but it's a challenge and it often requires more educational input to get there, as we talked about in the education unit. Okay. Oops, I want my clock back. Okay. Is this the birth of the business and business administration degrees, the formal creation of service sector degrees? I think you do see, business administration, I'm trying to think if you're thinking like a master's in business administration, that's a little bit different. That's like often people who took vocational degrees who end up, in management and want to, excuse me, bolster their credentials there. But yeah, I think largely, business and business degrees kind of come out of this era, and formal schools of business really grow, especially in the 90s and 2000s, right, to what they are today, as, a lot more people are going to be coming out into the service center. Going for a call center in 2020, and you can confirm it sucks. I understand that it is soul deadening because, if you've ever talked to someone in a call center, they're reading from a script and they can't deviate from it. And when they say, I'm really sorry that happened to you, they're not really sorry because they're dead inside. From working in a call center, right? They feel nothing. So yeah, it's a pretty terrible job, and I can't imagine doing it. Okay, so that's kind of our history, right? And that sort of takes us up to, Gen Z. Okay. So here are some very specifically Canadian stats, right? Basically, I took this from StatsCan, and this is, I think now a couple of years old. I think it goes up to like 2024. If I recall, I don't actually remember the exact dates, but, what are we looking at in terms of the job market in Canada? All right, so overall, right, Canadian young people age 15 to 30, less likely to have a job than older people. Now that, at least to some extent, makes sense, right? Some of them are going to be engaged in education, especially kind of at the, the closer you get to 15, the more that's the case, right? Because like 15 to 22, you're going to have a really good chunk of that population that is engaged either in high school or in, university post-secondary of some kind, right? And balancing work and those other obligations is difficult, right? In 2019, our employment rate of young Canadians was 67.7%, 67.3%. Geez, I can read. Lower than their counterparts in those older cohorts, right? Our 31 to 44-year-olds, it's in the 80% range, and our 45 to 54-year-olds, again, kind of in the 83% range. So that really makes sense, right? Because they're in school and jobs are, and likely, especially at that youngest period, like right when you get out of school, job searching can contribute to those periods of unemployment as well, because it's difficult to look for a job while you're employed, and often young people, especially coming out of education, are looking for jobs that are a good fit, and that can be really, really difficult to find, especially all throughout this period, right, 2019 till today. It's been a period where it's really, really difficult for young people to find work. Okay, more education equals a better rate of employment, right? So, I know I've maybe been a little negative on education in the education unit, but you're much better having an undergrad degree than not having one, right? So 9 in 10 young bachelor's degree holders not in school were employed in 2019, right? Compared to, barely half of their counterparts with no high school diploma. Now, that's not really a 100% fair comparison, but that's what's in the StatsCan numbers, right? But one thing that we do know is the trends where those with bachelor's degrees have a higher rate of employment continue through the life course, right? So I'll just kind of show you on this chart. What do I have on the next one? I'll show you here, right? So if we look at less than high school, right? And if we're talking the whole population, so that will include people who are still in high school, right? Relatively low rate of employment. High school only, right? Even our whole population, considerably lower than those that are that have more education, right? So if you have just a high school diploma, you're less likely to be employed. You're going to have probably more and longer periods of unemployment. So you've all made a wonderful decision in being here, right? You're doing the right thing in getting an education. And, if I mean, again, this doesn't account for wages, but just in terms of level of employment, like likelihood of being employed, you can see there's not a whole lot of difference between, say, just a post-secondary diploma of some kind an undergrad degree. And actually, above a bachelor's degree makes your odds of being employed slightly worse, more likely to be over-educated, and therefore hard to find a good fit in terms of jobs, right? So bachelor's degree seems to be the happy place in terms of level of employment, right? Right, and this is just excluding our full-time students. So that's the more kind of objective measure. But even, right, when we talk about our full-time students, we see pretty good employment numbers across the board, except for less than high school. You're in a rough spot if you have less than high school. And so that's why high school dropouts are such a concern. And even just high school, right, you're considerably lower than all the categories that have some kind of post-secondary. No surprises there. All right, so our real hourly wages for young employees by selected characteristics. Okay, so, men of all employees making slightly more than women. Same here, for just full-time employees. That kind of makes sense, right? Women, we know this from all the social science data, take a bit of a discount, largely, especially when they're young, right, and they're having children. They lose years out of the workplace, and that costs them in terms of future mobility. And employers may be slightly less likely to hire women or pay them a little bit less based on the notion that especially young women are likely going to be stepping out of the workplace to have children at some point, though increasingly that is not as true as it used to be. Okay, in terms of kind of dollars, right, per hour, this is a slightly weird measure because a lot of things aren't measured. A lot of salaries, especially for those, with a graduate or a undergraduate degree or higher, are just salaried employees, but they kind of try to calculate it back. But what do we see, right? Dollars per hour for all employees, right? If you have just less than high school, you're talking pretty minimum wage. It looks like about $17. And if you are a full-time employee, so you're, that's all. That's not excluding students. That's all employees, right? So including part-time. Full-time employees do a little bit better. It's like 19, but with less than high school. With just high school, you're only a little bit better in terms of wages. And the really big jumps, right, are first to some kind of post-secondary certificate or diploma. And that increases things nicely. You're now in the mid-20s. You get to the high 20s per hour with a bachelor's degree. And then for above a bachelor's degree, and this makes sense, right, masters and PhDs, you're going to earn the most money, you have the most education and hopefully skills. You're then, getting into the kind of low 30s in terms of dollars per hour on average, right? So again, more education equals better wages, higher levels of employment, and all of that stuff. Okay, let's jump forward. So this is an interesting one. Our employment rates by age group, 1976 to 2020. All right, so 30s, right? And again, this makes sense. They're in that kind of early churn part of the market. They're churning through, they're in school, they're looking for jobs, they're leaving jobs, and having periods of unemployment, right? So there's more churn in their lives. They're getting experience, maybe getting fired or laid off. So our youngest part of our cohort for men experiences more unemployment, lower rates of employment and much more unemployment. And if you look at, the unemployment rate for men and you look at that youngest part of the cohort, right, 15 to 30, you see the waves are a lot bigger, right? So when I said those macroeconomic conditions tend to have greater effects on younger workers, that's these lines right here, right? Much bumpier because they're much more likely during economic downturns to get laid off and then to be unemployed. It's considerably worse for men than it is for women, right? Now, women still have this sort of bumpy pattern, right, for our youngest workers, but those bumps are a lot smaller. And this largely seems to be related to the sectors that men and women work in. Men are more likely to work still in blue-collar sectors, which are more vulnerable economically to downturns, right? Things like construction, manufacturing, transportation, and trades are more market-driven. And a lot of the jobs that women do are more in the service sector, especially when they get more education into things that are a little bit more stable. Things like teaching, nursing, and social work, right? And other kind of service professions, administration, clerical and such, you still get patterns of unemployment where it goes up and down, but they're much less bumped. The bumps are smaller because those sectors tend to be affected less by macroeconomic forces. Now, for our older cohorts, right, they tend to have slightly higher, so our 31 to 44 and our 45 to 54, right, slightly higher rates of employment for men. For women down here, right, your older workers were less likely to be working, largely because you would have been talking probably women who were homemakers, right? It would have been less normal. Women would have left the labor force for a longer time when they had children and would have stayed out of the labor force for an extended period of time. But you see that, by the time we get to, the 2000s or the mid 90s and beyond, their employment rate is lower than men still, because some of them are out of the labor force, but it's closer than it was, right? Okay, I think that's all that's interesting. And yeah, our older workers experience less unemployment. And again, their waves are there, but they're way less bumpy than younger workers, right? So largely backing up what I said earlier in this unit. Breath of air. Okay, I need water. What time? Okay, and time, because the monitor's not showing the time. All right. So what types of job do we tend to see, right? So we kind of have three categories, right? For all individuals, right? So this would include students, and here we have excluding full-time students. What do we see? Well, young people, way less likely to be self-employed, which again is interesting, kind of considering what we saw, a few slides ago. Young people want to be self-employed, right? They're much more motivated to be entrepreneurs. But what we see, right, is you need a certain level of capital, right? So our older workers who have more of that, much more likely to be self-employed. Full-time jobs, right? So for both here and here, right, we see pretty stable, right? Our youth workers, right, if we include students, less likely to be employed full-time. If we exclude students, they're just a little bit less likely, to be employed full-time in that youngest part, our 15 to 19 part of the cohort. But in our 20 to 24, right, and our 25 to 30, so all of our young, teenagers and emerging adults, it's not a ton of difference, right, if you exclude full-time students, right? Everybody's sort of sitting at around 75% employed full-time. And, other employments, which is usually part-time work or maybe a little bit of work, say, as seasonal workers on like farms and other seasonal kind of employments. Our youngest part of the cohort is much more likely to be employed part-time. And as you get older, right, less likely to be employed part-time. Okay, so there we go. I think those charts all, I forget why this bottom chart is here. I should check. It's all in that report that I posted, but now I forget what the bottom part of this chart is. Types of jobs held by young and older workers. Okay, I don't remember. Let's move on. All right, I will look that up and get back to you. Okay, so wages. Here's, I think, one of the really interesting charts, and you'll note, right, this goes from 1981 to 2020, right, in terms of our younger and older workers. If we look back, at 1980, right, and our young workers here are, we're using slightly different metrics, 17 to 34. There's still a gap, right, between our younger and older workers, right? And again, 35 to 44 and 45 to 54. You're kind of expecting, older workers to make a little bit more. They have more experience. But the gap is relatively small in real terms. It's like, our youngest workers are earning, 17-ish dollars an hour, and our kind of middle of that range, right, our 35 to 44, earning somewhere around $20 an hour, right? And that's, if you transfer everything into 2019 dollars, right? So there's accounting for inflation. What you see over time, right, And again, this is that period that I was talking about. This is right at the beginning of that McJobs era, right? Where young people start losing that ability to come into the labor market with really good jobs. And as we move more towards the present, right, and 2020 is where this particular report ends, but you see that gap gets bigger and bigger, right? Our young workers are still making more in real terms in 2019 than they were, so this is right prior to COVID, right? They're still making more, but the gap between them and older workers has gotten considerably bigger, right? So older workers, and that 35 to 44 cohort is definitely doing the best in this particular report, though they're not far off from our 45 to 54s. Younger workers have definitely fallen behind in terms of wages. And the further we go through this era, the bigger that gap kind of gets, right? And there's moments where it's extremely big, but mostly it gets worse over time, right? And what you would kind of expect is that it's going to continue getting worse over time still. Alrighty. Okay. So this is our, so this is a kind of a weird one. So NEAT is a weird acronym, which is not, I give up. It's Friday. I can't do this anymore. No, I'm kidding. Not engaged in education, employment, or training. Right, so the EETs are education, employment, and training. So if you're an individual who's considered NEAT, right, by this kind of social statistics term, you're a young person or any person who's not being educated, not employed, and not doing training. So, percentage of young people who are neither employed nor in school by selected characteristics. Okay, so what do we see? Broadly speaking, which I say a lot, I don't know why, I like that phrasing, pretty low percentage of our 15 to 19-year-olds are not doing anything. And NEAT is considered kind of a social problem because these are the kind of young people or people in general that are stuck, right? And here we have three cohorts that are all within our teenage and emerging adult categories. They're stuck, right? Something has gone wrong. If you are, not employed or in school, there's going to be some percentage that are looking for work and it's just not there. But there are a group of these people that get stuck here kind of permanently, right? Where they simply are out of society, right? They're not engaged in any major social roles. I mean, the stereotype here is that you're living in your parents' basement, right? That's the one that usually gets kind of stuck on people. But it's a kind of categorization for young people who are struggling, in a sense, to launch into adulthood. Okay, so what does this look like? Well, not surprisingly, our 15 to 19-year-olds are the least likely to basically be in this category. Why? Well, because at least 15 to 17, 18, everybody's in school, right? Now, as you can see, there are still a few more men than women who are potentially out of the labor market and out of the education market, but we would expect, a percentage here. When we get to our 20 to 24, right, it goes up a bit. So now you've got, a solid like 13% of men, 20 to 24, and a slightly lower percent of women, closer to 10%, that are in this category. Now, for our women, and I know most women don't have children this young anymore, but there's going to be a percentage of those that are probably women who are caring for children, right? Because they've had children relatively young. Some of that is explained there. The men is not quite as easy to explain. These are usually men who we would think of as kind of in trouble socially. They're not achieving, they're not moving towards, what we consider kind of normal adult goals. And, roughly the same percentage of them are in that position at, in that 25 to 30% range. Like, still not a huge amount, but somewhere like 12%, right, are not employed or in education. So that's a lot of people in that cohort. Now, the number of women, in this category that are not engaged in education and they're not employed goes up again. And right, this is your babies. This is women having children, right? These are women who are caring for young children at home, right? Taking time out of the workplace for this. So this number, women, it goes up considerably from 24 to that 25 to 30 cohort, but it makes sense because, we expect women to take time out of the workplace somewhere between here and sort of their mid to late 30s, because that's when they're going to be having kids. Okay. So our biggest concerns here are obviously these people, right? Is our less than high school and only high school educated, who again have, 12 and probably around 13, 14% rate of being in this category, right? So more education is going to make you less likely to be in this category. And certainly it looks like your happy spot and the people most likely to have jobs, right, or be in education are those that already have a bachelor's degree. So that's kind of a good place to be. But more education here generally equals, fewer people outside the labor market or the training market, right? Now, obviously, if you have above a bachelor's degree, there's only so much more education you can get. But you can see even there is a certain number, about 10% of people with a degree above a bachelor's degree, that are still in this category of not being working and not in education. So, just having a master's or a PhD is not a panacea for this sort of thing. Okay. And people slightly more likely, immigrants or foreign-born individuals are slightly more likely to be in this category as well than, Canadian-born individuals, though the gap is really slight. It's about 2%, right? So not a huge gap, but slightly more likely. Okay, so what explains these Gen Z struggles? So I'm going to present a little bit of an argument here and sort of walk through a couple of things that theoretically should have happened in the Canadian economy, but hasn't happened, or actually should be in the process of happening, but doesn't appear to be. And I get these mostly from this guy, Richard Diaz. He's Chief Financial Advisor at IceCap Asset Management. And, he's an interesting guy. He was one of the hosts of a podcast called The Loonie Hour, which is a really interesting podcast. And he does some writing for Canadian publications as well. He's been published in places like The Hub, the Globe and Mail, and the National Post. And he makes three arguments that I find kind of interesting as it relates to young people. And one of the things that Diaz argues should be happening, well, basically what Diaz says is, given all the economic conditions we have, there are essentially three things that should happen that ultimately should really actually help young people and mean that Gen Z is doing particularly well, right? And keep in mind, right, when we look at it in terms of wages, they're not doing as well as they have in the past. Okay, so argument number one, and this is sort of inarguable, right? As the boomers have retired, right? Or as they are retiring, right? And keep in mind, right, so the oldest of our boomers would have turned 80 this year, right? Or would be turning 80 this year. Or 81? 81, I guess. 1945 is our first year of the boomers. So they should be turning 81, right? And then the youngest of them are they're in their 60s, right? So we should be seeing a pretty big exodus of boomers out of the labor market. Now, this should be good news. Like, the boomers are such a large generational cohort, right? And they've been occupying kind of upper and middle management positions in the workforce for a really, really long time. And so their gradual exit from the labor market should be really good news for younger workers, specifically because it should create labor shortages, right, in the market. And this is largely what economists have long predicted would happen when the boomers leave the labor market. Now, what that should mean is companies sort of scramble to hire younger workers. So you should have lower unemployment across the board, but much lower youth unemployment, right? Because you're going to bring in the workers that are coming into the market. The Gen Xers and millennials largely have already moved into the labor market. So the ones benefiting most from the boomers exiting the labor market should be our Gen Z cohort, right? Okay, now, because there are labor shortages, right, this is a straight supply-demand argument. Because there are labor shortages, what you should see is a sharp rise in youth wages, basically as employers fight to attract younger workers, right? Now, I will say, we largely saw this happening in the 2010s, right? So if we look at the early 2010s, we already had lots of boomers leaving the workforce, and companies were sort of falling all over themselves to attract young workers because of labor shortages. And this was across the economy. Now, it was a particularly hot market in, let's say, in Alberta, but I remember this, right? So if we go back to the year 2014, the economy in Alberta was particularly good. But one of the things that was happening was wages for even like people at the bottom end of the service industry, right? In something like food services, were getting wages that were considerably over the minimum wage, right? I think at the time, if I recall, McDonald's was paying something like $22 an hour, Starbucks was paying $25, right? So higher wages were happening because there was a worker shortage. And employers were offering incentives. And I recall this because I remember, I mean, I was too old at this point for this to do a kind of work for me, but I remember seeing things like Starbucks and McDonald's and other kind of retail places, especially big corporations, were offering young workers things like scholarships, right? That they would partially pay your tuition if you worked part-time. I know that sounds pretty good, right? Work at Starbucks part-time, work at, the grocery store part-time, and they will pay part of your tuition, right? This was largely because what we had was a labor shortage, right? Part of that was oil and gas was sucking away a lot of young workers, but also, as the boomers were retiring, there were too few workers to fill positions. People were, who had been in the lower tier of the service industry were moving up into better positions that were offered by the retiring boomers. And so that bottom tier was very, very competitive, and employers had to work really hard to attract young workers. And this is really good for young workers, right? If employers are fighting over you, they're going to do lots of things to be attractive to you. So when there's labor shortages, for one, we're going to see rises in youth wages and more incentives, right? Benefits, good hours, vacation weeks offered earlier, all these sorts of things to young workers. Okay. The other thing we should see is an increased focus on productivity in the Canadian economy. So the problem, and as you can probably tell because you've probably read the bottom of the slide, none of these things have happened in Canada, right? Youth unemployment remains high. If we look at the aggregate rate of youth unemployment in Canada, it's well into the double digits. And in many parts of the country, it's above 20%, right? Youth unemployment. So youth unemployment has remained stubbornly high, and in a lot of places it's actually gotten worse. Youth wages have risen, right, as we saw on our chart back here. We've seen aggregate rises in youth wages in, inflation-adjusted dollars, but much slower than the rates of older workers, and behind the rate of inflation, certainly. And Canadian productivity has badly lagged behind US productivity. But Canada, in terms of its overall productivity, is an absolute, I think we're in the third or the fourth quartile of OECD countries, right? Now, you don't want to be in the fourth quartile. That's the bad quartile, right? You're in the lowest quarter in terms of productivity, and I'll show you that in a sec. So, okay, for the neat slide, are they controlling for socioeconomic status? Not in this particular chart, right? This is just like aggregate across the board, saying like how many people in general are out of the labor market and education market. So this particular one is just raw statistics, right? This is just top line. If you're on maternity or paternity leave, yeah, you are not considered as part of the labor market. McDonald's offered a new iPhone at one point. That's still a pretty good deal, but not as good as we'll pay your tuition, right? That is a much better deal. Okay. And yeah, I mean, honestly, that only happens when demand is high. All right. Why is productivity important? And I'm going to point to this particularly. I have 2 minutes. I don't have time to talk about productivity. This is what happens when my clock's not working. The screen is not displaying the time. I forget what I'm talking about. Okay. Well, maybe I can talk about productivity really quick. No, it's Friday. I'm not going to try to bash through it in 2 minutes. We're going to talk about productivity on Monday, and we'll tell you why productivity is so important to how you all are going to do in life and why living in Canada might not be the best thing given how important productivity is. Though I do love Canada. Go Team Canada. Olympic stuff. Yay. Oh. Being 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it sure feels like 6 o'clock in the evening. Everything is garbage.